Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony, a historian of science and technology and curator of the Apollo Spacecraft Collection. Her research focuses on the history of space diplomacy, examining how Project Apollo shaped and mediated the United States' role in the global stage. Today, we will speak about her latest book, Operation Moonglow, a political history of Project Apollo. Professor Muir-Harmony, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This book is intimidated, so much science, so much diplomacy, so much behind the stage, like we regular day-to-day individual cannot imagine all the diplomacy that goes on behind the scene over such a huge project as the Project Apollo. And then the brains that are required to document and put that together and put it in a digestible manner so that we regular individuals can understand the magnitude of this event.
Well, that was part of my goal with the book, is to bring the story of the diplomacy behind the American space program to a broader audience. And it's a topic I had worked on for many years, and I wanted to make sure that it was accessible and interesting because the stories are so rich and the material is so rich. And I thought that it would be valuable to try to share that information in a way that was interesting and accessible. So hopefully I achieved it.
I think you did. Well, the main thing that you achieved is to pick the interest, because as I was reading each line, I was going into YouTube and Google and double checking and seeing images and videos. So, it's a nice step to get people interest in science, technology, and space exploration. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. What got you into this field of expertise?
Well, I was always interested in the history of astronomy. And then after college, I got a job at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum doing research. And that was my first exposure to the history of science diplomacy and the role that astronomy and spaceflight played within the Cold War. And so I was working on a project on the history of this Smithsonian observatory that had observatories around the world. And I was so interested in those dynamics on the ground in each of the different countries between the Americans working there and then the local staff. And then I decided to go to graduate school to study this topic and to explore it more in depth. And so I studied the history of science and technology in graduate school for many years, and just have been continually interested by this topic and all the different sort of dimensions of it. And then I ended up at the Smithsonian as a curator and responsible for the Apollo collection, which is very fortuitous. And I've been in that position for a number of years now. And I work on exhibits, and I work with the collection, and I do public outreach, and then research and writing, like the book we're going to speak about today.
Okay, great. So can you, let's get into the topic of the book. Can you refresh the memory for those who have put our history books in the bookshelf? What exactly is the Apollo 11 project?
Sure. So the Apollo program was the American program to send humans to the moon. And President John F. Kennedy proposed it in 1961. And he said, the goal was to send humans to the moon, land them there, return them safely back to the Earth before the end of the decade. And the goal was achieved in 1969 with the Apollo 11 mission. And this project was the largest civilian technological program in U.S. history. It was extraordinarily expensive, over 4% of the federal budget by the mid-60s. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on the program, spread across the country and across the world. At the time, it was $25 billion, which today estimates suggest it's closer to about $280 billion. So just a massive project on a massive scale. And when Kennedy proposed sending humans to the moon, spaceflight was brand new, and that's such an important part of that story. And actually, today we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the first human spaceflight. So the Soviet Union accomplished Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight in April of 1961, and the United States had one brief suborbital flight. So spaceflight was brand new. The first satellite was 1957. Kennedy proposed sending humans to the moon in 1961. So it was a really compressed timeline, and it required just an incredible, massive mobilization of the nation's resources. But at the same time, part of Kennedy's aim was to win the hearts and minds of the world. And so it wasn't just about sending humans to the moon, it was about influencing the larger geopolitical order. And he saw sending humans to the moon as an effective way to influence the politics and societies of other nations, to increase alignment, and just advance U.S. foreign relations objectives more generally.
Okay, so there is a lot of politics going on. Of course, there is a competition between the US and the Russians. Can you just set the stage? What exactly is going on?
Sure. So after World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States both sort of stepped into roles as superpowers. And this is the same moment that there was establishment of many newly independent nations. And so the end of colonial empires and the post-colonial movement. So you have the emergence of new nations around the world. And then you have the Soviet Union and the United States competing for influence. With the introduction of nuclear weapons, they looked for other ways to compete because it limited the potential of traditional warfare. And so things like the space program became important venues to demonstrate the strengths of each respective society. So the Soviet Union was sending satellites and humans and robotic probes into space, and the United States was doing the same thing, and they were doing it to demonstrate their national technological and scientific capabilities, and also industry as well. So that's part of the space race and sort of this larger context.
Okay, so as I understand it, the Soviet Union took leadership in this. They sent the first spacecraft to outside the Earth, and then the United States felt the need to respond in order to gain influence around the world, to show that the United States was either equal or superior to the Soviet Union. Is that right?
Exactly, yes. So the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957. This was the first time humans had sent a satellite into space, and it made a huge impact, and it made people in the United States question whether or not the U.S. was this leader in science and technology, and people around the world paid attention. And then the next month, the Soviet Union sent another satellite into space, but this one with a dog, Laika, and that was an even bigger blow to the United States. And then the U.S. tried to send a satellite, exploded on the launch pad. So they eventually got it in 1958, but for the first few years of the space race, the U.S. was really trailing behind, and the Soviet Union also achieved the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin's flight, which we just spoke about. So in the initial years of the space race, the Soviet Union was leading, and it was a huge threat to the United States.
So this was a race to win above all costs, and it was extremely expensive, not as expensive as the coronavirus, but expensive nevertheless. Can you tell me if there was any pushback, or everyone endorsed President Kennedy into this endeavor?
Well, so there was some skepticism. Even Kennedy was a little skeptical, and there were studies about sending humans to the moon and how much it would cost that were undertaken in 1960 during the Eisenhower administration. President Eisenhower said that's way too expensive, it's not worth it. And even Kennedy was told how much it would cost when he first became president, and he said, it's not worth it. Let's think about this later. And but things really changed. So when the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into space in April, and then a few days later, there was the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. That was a failure, and it was backed by the CIA. That was another blow to U.S. prestige. And so at that point, Kennedy knew that the United States had to invest in some kind of large-scale, impressive scientific and technological program, and he chose the Apollo program. And so he had even himself been skeptical about the cost of this type of mission, but he thought after this sequence of events, he thought that this is what the United States had to do and invest in. And many members of Congress also agreed, and they were behind this type of mission. So some people did question the cost, and especially throughout the 1960s, many people in the public were wondering about why the United States was spending this much on space exploration when there were other problems on Earth. And actually, it was not that popular of a program domestically. So for most of the 1960s, less than half of Americans thought that this was the right way for the government to spend money. It was popular around the first lunar landing, but for the most of the 60s, people were skeptical about, why are we spending this much on space when we have so many other problems to deal with on Earth?
People still ask that question. So, I mean, bottom line, this is more a race for diplomacy and influence, as opposed to wanted to further our knowledge in science and space, right?
Yeah, so it was primarily motivated by this interest in diplomacy and this expectation of its impact in geopolitics. But there were important scientific elements and experiments conducted during the Apollo program, and it did contribute to our knowledge of the moon and the solar system. And so although the United States didn't send people to the moon for science, there was actually a big scientific component of the program. It just wasn't the main reason. It wouldn't have been enough to justify the price tag.
Right. Okay. So, looking back, if a person asks you, was it worth it? What would you say?
Well, I think there are a number of different ways to interpret it. And I think it's important to compare to something like the Vietnam War, which by the end of the 1960s, the United States was spending as much on Vietnam in 1 year as the entire Apollo program. Wow. And they were, both the Vietnam War and the Apollo program at their heart had very similar objectives, which was geopolitical power. So it was to assert American foreign relations interests, and especially in opposition to the threat of communism. And so, and they're just two very, very different approaches. And Apollo is this soft power approach. It's about winning the world over and winning hearts and minds, and pursuing something that's peaceful. Whereas something like a proxy war is another way to sort of try to limit the communist influence around the world, but it was more costly, and it really also, I think, undermined a lot of the ways that people felt about the United States and its priorities and values at that time in history. And so when we think about Apollo, I think it's so important to put it in this larger context, and not just was it worth $25 billion on its own, but thinking of it in terms of how nations spend their resources and what are the objectives. And I think there were incredible things that were gained from Apollo. So the science was part of that, but it was also, it promoted a lot of goodwill around the world, and it made people feel like challenges could be overcome, and it encouraged a sense of global unity and community, and those types of things I think are really positive. It's a hard question to answer, and I think there are lots of different ways that you could answer it. If I was Kennedy, would I have made the same decision? I'm not sure, but I think there's a lot to be said for nations that invest in soft power versus hard power, and invest in collaborative programs or things that are peaceful to advance their interests.
Okay, well, the United States shows their superiority in this stage of science. Can you tell us about what happened when the astronauts come back? What's the aftermath, the diplomacy going on, the influence? How did they reap the benefits of this trip?
So the first lunar landing, I should say, was was the most viewed event in world history at that time. So between 500 and 600 million people watched that landing live. In many countries, it was the first international live broadcast that was ever broadcast. And then people listened to it on the radio too. So half the world's population was following this flight. When the astronauts returned to Earth, they went on a diplomatic tour of the world, and they acted as President Nixon's representatives. Their job was to meet with foreign leaders. They did motorcade parades. They met with scientists. They also had events at big stadiums and things like that. It was a whirlwind tour, 2 months. They circled the entire globe, and it was seen as a really successful trip. They were seen as great ambassadors for the United States and sort of promoting some of the best qualities and characteristics of the country. And so it was called Giant Step. It was received really, really well. It was an elaborate trip, and it was a way to take advantage of some of the enthusiasm and goodwill after the first lunar landing.
And since this is a competition against the Russians, I wonder, how did the Russians react against this? Did they just stop all research, or did they double down?
So the Soviet Union had lunar exploration programs. They actually had 2 different types of programs with that goal, but they were running into challenges, especially when it came to their heavy lift launch vehicle, and so they continued to pursue that goal, but they had some technological problems and some limited resources, and so it wasn't a clear, turn the light switch off kind of change after the first lunar landing, but that did affect things quite a bit in the Soviet Union. But they had a whole variety of other types of programs as well. And so continued to invest in spaceflight and space exploration. And I think importantly, ended up collaborating with the United States on the Apollo Soyuz program, and looked for ways for sort of international engagement and cooperation.
And okay, so this happened in 1969, so a long time from today. Where is the space exploration now? I mean, we have supercomputers in our pockets, like our phone is bigger, it's more powerful than the computer they used to send Apollo to the moon. So where are we now? What new frontiers are we discovering?
So it's a very exciting time for space exploration. There's a renewed interest in sending humans to the moon. There's also an interest in Mars exploration, especially with some of these robotic probes. And the United States might fly a helicopter on Mars this week, which is pretty unbelievable and exciting. And there are lots of plans both within the United States and around the world to explore these other places. And I think also very importantly, it's always worth noting that the space program within the United States and other countries is far larger than human spaceflight. And so while we have things like the International Space Station, which is exciting, and the Artemis program, which is going to return humans to the moon, it's also important to note all the other things that are being done in space with earth sciences, planetary sciences, solar science related work, space-based observatories. So it's this huge ecosystem in space, so important for things like communications and Earth observation, where we get our weather, GPS, all sorts of things. And so there's exciting things when it comes to exploration, but there's also very exciting things about how spaceflight is helping and sort of improve life on Earth as well.
And okay, so before we had the Russians, we had the US, and now we have private enterprise as well getting into the race. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what's the role of private companies getting into this, should we say, business?
Well, it's important to note that private enterprise has always been really important to spaceflight. And with the Apollo program, over 90% of the people who worked on it were in industry. So they were contractors and subcontractors. Actually, a very small percentage came from NASA. And the relationship between NASA and private industry has changed over time. But industry has always been critical to the American space program, and I think it will continue to be, and that the relationship may evolve and change over time. There is a lot of private investment in exploration right now, and that could shift things. But many of these large companies are working very closely with the United States government, and also uh, working with grants and funding and contracts that help them develop rockets and spacecraft and other parts of that system.
Yes, but historically, the United States have been the financier of all this exploration. But now, there's a billionaire race, and all of them want to send their toys to space, and they are putting that out of their own pockets. So I think that's a little bit of a nuance. Before that, there's always been private enterprise involved, but now it's just regular billionaires just financing these rockets to space.
Well, these billionaires are using U.S. government contracts to get there. So the Falcon, for instance, the SpaceX rocket, a huge percentage of the research and development that went into that was actually funded through government contracts. And so, and Blue Origins has a contract for developing a lunar module. And so, although there is private investment in spaceflight, there is still this very important relationship between private industry and the U.S. government. And so, although it's not all coming from government, and some of it's private contracts, launching communication satellites and things like that, the relationship between the government and private industry continues to be really important and really essential to moving this development forward.
And is space exploration a big part of politics still, as big as in the 1960s, or now has taken a secondary role?
It doesn't play the same type of role that it did in the 1960s. In the 1960s, it was the national priority. It was a major national priority. And then when President Nixon became president, he changed things and he said spaceflight should be one of many national priorities. And it has remained that way since the Nixon administration. So it is one of many national priorities. I saw the recent proposed budget for NASA for next year. I think it's close to $25 billion. So it is still substantial, but it's not on the level that it was during the Apollo program. In general, it tends to be about 0.5% of the federal budget, whereas during the Apollo program, it reached over 4%. So it's a different scale. It's different in terms of national priority. It still is considered a national priority. It's just not the national priority.
Okay, well, last question. What's the future of space exploration? Are we going to reach Mars and other planets, or are we going to, I don't know, the imagination is the limit. Are we going to be like Star Trek and exploring planets, or what do you see in the next, I don't know, 20, 40, 100 years of space exploration?
Well, I think we're going to continue to explore the moon and get a better understanding of the moon. And I think that we'll explore Mars. I don't know the timeline for sending humans to Mars. It's an incredible challenge. It will require the development of a lot of new techniques and also technology. So it's unclear when that's going to happen. If it's going to be in my lifetime, I don't know. But I do think we'll continue to send robotic probes to Mars and to learn more about that planet and perhaps a sample return, which would be very, very exciting. So part of this current mission is to scoop up a sample, and hopefully a future mission will go and retrieve it. And then we can learn more about Mars. So, and perhaps we'll visit Venus and learn a bit about Venus as well. So I think that there's a lot of exciting programs in the future, also when it comes to astrophysics as well. The James Webb Space Telescope is going to be launched this fall, which people are very excited about the potential of that. So there's a lot coming, but it's unclear exactly, will humans reach Mars? Someday, but I don't think anyone knows exactly when that will be.
Well, all this is super, I don't know. I mean, it's reality, but it almost reads like science fiction because it's so, unless you are in this environment where you get to see the rockets and talk to astronauts, for us, it's not different than science fiction on TV, but it's just amazing that it's real. It's not the imagination of some crafty author. And I'm so thankful that you wrote this book. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you.
So the title of the book is Operation Moonglow: A Political History of Project Apollo, and people can find me at the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian, and also on Twitter and Instagram. I post spacey things primarily, as you might guess. But yeah. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Oh, it's me and our audience who are just happy to hear you, boy. Thank you so much.